Hello everyone, welcome to Field Notes, an exploration of functional medicine. I'm Rob Downey, a family practice MD and Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner. I'm coming to you from Seaworthy Functional Medicine in Homer, Alaska. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. Today we are fortunate enough to have another thought leader in functional medicine, Shivan Sarna, who's an expert in irritable bowel syndrome and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which we'll refer today as SIBO, so we don't end up with our tongues twisted. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to help get the word out about small intestine bacterial overgrowth and the good news, the bad news, the confusion, the clarity.
Well, I'm really glad that we get this time in that you and I both know that so many people suffer from this. It's such a critical topic. And I want to start by pointing out then that part of your personal journey is dealing with this diagnosis yourself about 5 years ago in terms of time of diagnosis. And now you've pulled together a community and resources to educate. As we were getting ready for today's interview, you pointed out that you're a patient, not a doctor, in terms of where you're coming from and providing these resources. And then you got a background in many, many years of teaching yoga, and also a background in television. So right. I'm sure your communication skills are highly sharpened by that part of everything. So is there anything I should add, Shivan?
I think that I just want to bring a message of hope and connect people with the experts and bust some myths. And this is the information that I'm about to share is the information that I wish I had had 5 years ago, or even, well, actually when I was 5, when I got my first round of food poisoning that led to my IBS and SIBO.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great place to start, that message of hope, and that certainly fits with the mission of this podcast, which is to get the good word out about functional medicine and how much better things can be, or even transformative for people who feel stuck. And probably a good brief comment is just that of the folks that I take care of in my functional medicine practice, gosh, the folks with IBS and SIBO are so frustrated. They feel so stuck and fatalistic. And so just can't imagine a better group to get the good news that they can get better answers, they can move forward. Should we start with your own, having you talk about your own journey a bit? Is that a good place to start?
Sure. And I'll just keep this very brief, because really this is about you and your patients and the world learning about how they can help themselves, but just for a little inspiration, and maybe you can relate. And that is that my parents were importers from India. And I would travel with them when I was a little girl, as well as combined in that 1 year, I went to upstate New York on a field trip from my big school in New York City, and we milked cows, and then we drank the milk right after we milked the cows. I'm like, 8. And I got very sick from my trip to India, as well as milking the cow. So that was like from 5 to 8. I had actually a couple of episodes where I had definitely a food poisoning scenario. And I wasn't really going to the bathroom regularly. And I didn't realize that that was an issue. My father was from India. My mother's Irish and Welsh. And my dad was like asking, because he had noticed, and then my mom started asking more, and I'm like such a little kid, but I'm like, why are you invading my personal space? And then I got a little weird shame thing going. It was like, I remember this very vividly. But the bottom line is, if anybody who's hearing my voice can relate to a food poisoning episode or stomach flu in quotes, where you had diarrhea or you threw up, and then you weren't really the same afterwards. You had constipation or diarrhea, or alternating constipation and diarrhea. Your patterns just weren't the same. You eat food, you bloat. You leave the house, your pants are a certain tightness. By the time you're at lunch or after, your pants are really tight, like you blew up in a short period of time. You may very well have something called SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And there are a lot of underlying causes for it, from food poisoning to adhesions, which can be from a horse kicking you in the stomach, to surgeries, to inflammation, endometriosis, scleroderma. The list goes on and on of what would be impacting your motility of the small intestine, sweeping out the bacteria that is there. And when it overgrows because it hasn't been swept out through a mechanism called the migrating motor complex, also known as MMC, when that is impaired, then this bacteria can proliferate in the small intestine and leads to you becoming a microbrewery, where the food you eat starts to ferment. You get gassy that may never be released through like a fart or a burp because you really have such little motility. And ultimately that can lead to B12 imbalances, low ferritin, anemia, restless leg syndrome, rosacea, infertility. I mean, the list goes on and on. SIBO is really interesting because it's caused by something else and it causes other things.
Both upstream and downstream manifestations. Your summary illuminates those so distinctly that I think is a helpful place for folks that have heard about it before but need to know more, or people that haven't, a good starting place. So what do you recommend for people to figure out if they've heard this from you or others, or they've read a functional medicine book or watched an inspiring podcast and they think, well, how am I going to figure this out? What do they do then?
Well, the good news is there's a roadmap. We have a course that Dr. Allison Seebecker and I developed called the SIBO Recovery Roadmap course. That's one thing you can do. You can come to the website, SIBOSOS.com, or Dr. Allison Seebecker's website, SIBOinfo.com. She's a world-renowned SIBO expert who's been my colleague and collaborator in a variety of these summits that I've done and the documentary that I did and these courses. But first and foremost, breath test. So when you test, you know. And here's the other tricky part, is that SIBO also mimics candida and parasites. There are a lot of other things that it mimics, but those are really the two most common. And so you want to do a 3-hour lactulose breath test. I'm saying that very slowly because it's a lot of syllables. And if your doctor doesn't know what it is your job to educate that doctor. And you take a substrate of non-digestible sugar solution that feeds the bacteria in the small intestine. You do a 12-hour prep diet, 12-hour fast. So a lot of people will sleep and then do this test in the morning. You drink this sugary substance, and then you breathe into test tubes every 20 minutes for 3 hours. And you can do it in the doctor's office, but you can also do it at home, which is awesome. You can get it shipped to the house. And then you have to make sure that somebody who really knows what they're doing interprets the test. And that can show you if you have one of 3 gases. There's actually a new breath test called Trio Smart, which is at this time the only one that also measures for the 3rd gas, which I'm about to describe. You're going to have hydrogen producing bacteria in your small intestine overgrowing, methane producing archaea, which is like bacteria, but not officially. You could have hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria. And what happens is with these different microbes, they consume your food and then they ferment it and then they like fart out these different gases. And if you have hydrogen, you tend to have diarrhea. If you have the methane producers, you tend to have constipation or mixed. If you have the hydrogen sulfide, often it's associated with diarrhea, but not always. So you want to test, because then when you test, you know, and when you test and you know, it will dictate your treatment. I know it's a lot, you guys. I know, I really do, but it's important that you have this information so you're not guessing. Wouldn't it be terrible if you spent a lot of time and money on a treatment and it turns out you have parasites after all? That would be a shame. And I hear about it every single day. I actually hear more people not, just being told you have IBS, bye-bye. And then they're just, stuck. heartbreaking.
Well, what you're sharing is so important. I want to briefly add two things for our audience. One is that Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioners are trained in the recognition and testing for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and recognition of irritable bowel syndrome, and not, just throwing medications at it. And then I realized a little ways into my own SIBO testing for my patients that it wasn't intuitive to the person how the test worked. It's such an unusual test in terms of the clinical science because the gases get absorbed into the bloodstream and then cleared by the lungs into the test tubes. And so these gases that are produced are taking this interesting route to get to where we capture them and get this diagnostic information. And again, once folks, they have it, I think they're halfway there because so many of them have this aha moment of, oh my gosh, now I've got something to work with.
Yeah. It's a weird feeling to get a diagnosis of a condition and be relieved.
Yeah.
Because usually you want the thing to be a negative, right? Yeah, oh no, I don't have anything wrong with me. But if you have symptoms, you've got a condition, you just don't have a name for it. You don't have any description for it other than I just feel bad and I'm bloated and maybe gassy and I have weird, my digestion's fine one day, terrible the other. I was so relieved to finally get the diagnosis, but that was after a very long time, decades. And also my diagnosis, the first person who interpreted the test interpreted it incorrectly. And so I lost 18 months. It was very
That's a pain point. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
so what does the person do once it comes into focus? They've got it. Then not only how do they be successful, but you and I have seen so many people have a protracted healing course. So their healing ramp is slow and shallow or very up and down. So how can they have the most rapid progress possible with the fewest valleys and the most peaks?
Amen. I'm all about it. Well, first of all, there are studies have been done to show that an antibiotic called Refaximen stays in the small intestine and is very, very effective for addressing SIBO. It is what you would give a patient who had traveler's diarrhea. E. coli, that kind of thing is what is usually, there are a couple more that are causing SIBO. Refaximen combined with neomycin addresses fairly effectively the methanogen producers. Now they're working on more and more treatments for hydrogen sulfide. They don't have a ton of studies about what addresses hydrogen sulfide, but clinically there are people who are making observations that are quite effective. So there are 3 treatments you can do, which is some of the classical antibiotics that I just described, although Refaximen is not a classic antibiotic as it doesn't ruin your entire microbiome and it stays in the small intestine. You can do herbal antibiotics. Gerald Mullins actually did a study comparing Candibactin, AR, and BR to the Refaximen treatments. And while it took 4 weeks instead of 2 weeks to lower the gases of approximately the same amount, it's nice because you can kind of DIY that and you don't need to have a script, and Refaximen in certain scenarios is very expensive depending on your insurance. And then the third option, which is one of the most underrated, but also treacherous, is called the elemental diet, which is a liquid diet, which sounds insane, but it is starving the bacteria and therefore killing it versus just killing the bacteria from an antibiotic perspective. It's also it's really referred to as the most effective treatment, but it's hard because you're just doing this liquid for 14 to 17 days. But
starving them out.
Yeah, but the good news is there are some new formulations that taste much better than the original formulations. There's one called Elemental Heal by Dr. Michael Ruscio. There's one from Integrative Therapeutics that is Physician's Elemental Diet. And by the way, even if you're just trying to figure out your gut, they can be really great for helping to calm the gut. And while you're still getting nutrition, but not spending a lot of activity digesting.
Nice. Nice. And the question you get asked over and over again, but it'll be so important for the audience for this podcast. What do people with IBS and SIBO need to know about how to eat?
Okay, excellent. So, okay, I'm just take a breath. Here we go. IBS is often managed by medication that helps you go to the bathroom, like Linzess, for example, is an IBS medication, and a low FODMAP diet, which is ultimately a low fermentable carb diet. What if you could find out your underlying cause and actually do some of the SIBO breath tests, do the treatment, and actually improve your IBS? So that's one of my missions to do, is to help people get off of the cycle of, I have IBS, I can only eat certain foods. Now, if you definitely have SIBO, you're doing probably a low FODMAP diet and maybe even a more strictly broad, actually more narrow in a way. You're eating less foods because low fermentable foods in a broader scope, you want to do as little fermentable foods as possible, which is weird to start thinking about food as being fermentable, but that's what this is all about, because you want to not give your bacteria overgrowth fodder, right?
Mm-hmm.
The main point I'm trying to get to, and I buried the lead, is that the diet does not cure SIBO or IBS. It manages the symptoms. Mm-hmm. So that is so important. A lot of times we can do like a low histamine diet and calm everything down and, maybe reduce the histamines. That's a little bit different. This is about strictly managing the bloat, managing the symptoms. It will not resolve your SIBO. That's just all there is to it. But it will make you feel better. And it can make you feel better within 2 days, 3 days. It's amazing.
Right. So my takeaway from that is people need to know that it's a key component, but not adequate in its own right.
Right.
So people need to put together that whole healing journey.
SIBO is a kind of thing that is very different because it's a lot of patient self-care as well as practitioner support. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, if you really pay a lot of attention and you really are diligent, you can do a lot of it on your own, with constantly keeping your underlying cause in mind. But there are breath tests you can order for at home, depending on where you live. Lactulose is a prescription in the United States. It's not in other countries. You can do the herbal route. You can do the elemental diet and get another test. You got to retest after that first treatment to find out if the treatment's even working. And if it's not working, it's very famous also to rotate the treatment. So maybe you do Refaximen and you do a breath test, you see it comes down a little bit, and then you switch to the elemental diet, and then it comes down a lot. And then after the elemental diet, you might switch to herbals. So I think that's very unusual versus like other illnesses. It's pretty much here's the drug, here's the thing to do, and see it in 2 weeks. This is more of an ongoing process. But the good news is you have some choices. And if one thing didn't work, you have to keep going and keep going through the list.
And I find as people are improving, then they feel encouraged. They get momentum because they are getting improvement. So they get a sense, if I persist, I can make headway.
Yeah. And especially in a condition that is very, very frustrating and you feel like is never going to be better.
Yeah. So you're being super generous with your time today, Shivan. There's 2 things I wanted to make sure we talked about. One is just for our listeners to know that Refaximen really is a fascinating antibiotic because it doesn't leave the gut. And so as a MD who's done a lot of prescribing over the years, less so now as a functional medicine MD, but lots of prescribing familiarity, the concentrations of the bacteria killing compound are heightened because the compartment that the medication is traversing is very confined to the gut, as opposed to getting diluted into the whole sort of bucket of the body. And then I'm fascinated by this aspect then of how Rifaximin avoids bystander casualties, because that's sort of the bugaboo of so many antibiotics. Are you comfortable commenting on that at all? About people having an intact gut microbiome after, or is there a slight denudement, but it's like the downside is worth the transient hit?
Right. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. So Dr. Mark Pimentel is really the expert here. This is the doctor out of Cedars-Sinai who has really been leading the way in SIBO treatments. He created a protocol back in 2006 that is still used today. He's the one who said, did the studies to show that Refaximen, also known as Xifaxan, does the trick. Really brilliant, wonderful man. And I've been lucky enough to interview him several times, and he's really contributed heavily to my work of getting this word out. And, I think the takeaway I have from talking to him extensively about this is it stays in the small intestine. The small intestine is in his new research very different than the microbiome of the large intestine, like another world. So I feel very confident about the safety. Personally, I'm not a doctor. This is my opinion as a person who cares about her microbiome, who just did a summit on the microbiome. I'm a big fan of Refaximen. The neomycin is the thing that freaks me out a little bit more. And that is the one that would address your entire microbiome. But if you have high levels of methane producers and you can't go to the bathroom for days at a time, you start to think, you know what, it's going to be worth it.
Right.
Especially when there's an end in sight. You do the treatment, you do another test. You can see, did it work? Did it bring down this gas level? Maybe you had a 70 of parts per million of methane in your breath test, and you just did a treatment and it brought you down 15 points, which is reasonable. That's very exciting. And Refaximen can typically be done multiple rounds without losing efficacy and without you becoming resistant to it. And then maybe after you did the neomycin, you move to Alimed, which is allicin, which is the active ingredient in garlic. Whereas if I ate a piece of garlic, it would kill me gut-wise. But in Alimed, which is an incredible supplement / herbal antibiotic, you don't have to always stick with neomycin. That's why it's so cool that you get to, I call spin the plate. So you don't have to always stick with the same treatment.
Yeah, that's ironic, isn't it? That the plant source of the allicin is a fermenter, but when you take the active ingredient, then it can really pack a lot of punch against those methanogens.
Yeah.
So one thing that I would think of as not a secret, but an area I always emphasize and underscore, and this may be a good area to wrap on, along with making sure people know how to access your resources. And I find that a lot of my patients with irritable bowel syndrome and or SIBO are not as familiar as they perhaps need to be, that the rest and digest nervous system needs to be supported by mindfulness, yoga, positive attitude, enough rest,
meditation, chill. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I want to mention that, and I also wanted to just talk briefly about a prokinetic, which will help to reduce relapse. Okay, so before I talked about the parasympathetic nervous system, I just want to talk about, you do the breath test, you do the treatment, you retest, you do the treatment, maybe you do another treatment, retest, and now you have a negative SIBO breath test. Well, if you have an underlying cause like I do, which is the antibodies that are positive after food poisoning that have then impaired my migrating motor complex of sweeping out the debris from my small intestine, what can I do to make sure that the SIBO is at bay for as long as possible? You can do something called a prokinetic, which helps to activate the migrating motor complex. You can do meal spacing. When your stomach has food in it or calories in it, then your body does not sweep out the small intestine. So meal spacing, meaning like 4 or 5 hours between meals or between taking in calories, and doing a prokinetic at night when you don't have food in your stomach can help to make sure you're doing your cleansing waves as often as possible. That's one thing. And that is what a lot of people overlook are prokinetics. And what's a prokinetic? It could be Motil Pro, ginger. If you have GERD, ginger can reflux on you and be very painful. Resilor, Motegrity in this country is what it's called. Prucalopride is the other name for it. What else am I missing here?
You know, my memory is N-acetylcysteine, NAC, which is also a detox supporter, but I would have to go double check that. IFM's got a nice list of like 7 or 8, including ginger and Iberogast. It's a really interesting old school combination product.
Yeah.
Kind of an old playbook, but a fascinating prokinetic.
Yeah, pretty miraculous. That's whether you have constipation, diarrhea, nausea. Iberogast is definitely something to look into. I can't stand the taste of it personally because I'm a super taster, but I have other friends who crave it. It definitely works. It definitely works. In one of the courses that Dr. Seebecker and I did, like we were talking about it, and I wasn't feeling well that day. And so I literally on the video, like drank some, and like 20 minutes into the video, I'm like, I gotta go to the bathroom. The stuff works. What can I say? I feel so much better. I'm full tilt, you know, full TMI here, but it does work. And it works even if, and that's the other thing. If you are taking a prokinetic, it's not a laxative, but it does help the migrating motor complex. I'm just touching on some top level stuff here, but to your point about the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, again, to oversimplify. And I, doctor, could not keep these two concepts straight. I'm like, which one's the one where I'm relaxed? Which one's the when I'm being chased by a tiger? So I figured it out like this. I'm stressed, so I would like some sympathy, please. So when you're stressed, the tiger is chasing you, you need sympathy. That is the sympathetic nervous system. And then the other one is the parasympathetic, and that's when you are in rest and digest, when you've had that massage, when you meditated, when you are calm and peaceful. And when you are calm and peaceful in that way, and your nervous system is relaxed, rest and digest, your migrating motor complex and your entire digestive system can function more effectively. If you're constantly in this state of like, then you're not going to be able to have the migrating motor complex work as effectively. If you want an example of where stress impacts your health, here is a beautiful one. There are so many others, but this is a very straightforward one that you got to figure out a way to get more in the rest and digest than fight or flight, whether it's acupuncture, where it's the bliss of a yoga class, the walk in the woods, the walking barefoot in the grass, whatever it is. We need to figure out how to bring it into our worlds more effectively. And it's easy to say that. It's like saying enlightenment. Everyone needs to be enlightened. Yeah, it's easy to say. It's very hard to do. But that is imperative in the brain, gut, brain efficiency.
Yeah. Gosh, what a great tour of IBS and SIBO. This is very distilled. It packs a lot of punch.
I've been talking about it for a long time now.
Yeah. So how do if folks are excited and fired up by what we've discussed today and they want to access your community and learn and benefit, how do they do that?
Well, you can come to the Facebook community. It's SIBO SOS community, and the SOS has come to mean save ourselves. I used to want someone to sweep in and just rescue me, but then I realized I had to do it myself. So the SOS still worked. And we have over 16, almost 17,000 people in there who are communicating about this condition and sharing tips and ideas. It's a very safe environment. So we'd love to have you there. Also, my website, SIBOSOS.com, Dr. Seebecker's website, SIBOinfo.com. She really has led the way in getting free information out to people about this condition. My book's coming out February 2021 called Healing SIBO, She's working on her book right now, so that we can look forward to as well. We have courses, we have free information, we've got all kinds of stuff to help you get connected with other, SIBO specialists. So it's a thriving community that we're very excited to have you join. And, part of me is like, hey, I hope you don't have it.
Yeah.
Hope you're listening to this going, well, that's, Jan and Jim and Jerry. That's not me. Thank God. That would be great. But if you're like, oh my gosh, tears running down your face going, finally, someone can understand what I'm going through. I'm not alone. Welcome. And please come join us.
And let's close with, I think as we were getting ready for today's interview, you also mentioned a cookbook.
We do have a cookbook. When I first started this project, I started with a summit. I've done now 4 summits on the topic and the microbiome. So what I started was back then is asking some of the speakers to contribute their favorite SIBO recipes, and a beautiful cookbook has come from that. And so our gift to you is the SIBO SOS, SIBO friendly cookbook, which has lots of delicious recipes in it.
Takes people's stress down, because then they can kind of jump in and not,
right.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your time today. It's really been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Doctor. Wonderful to have the opportunity to share the work. I appreciate your efforts and your help.
Thanks for the positive feedback. Looks like you've got a little sunshine there. I hope you have a nice rest of your day.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, you too. Good luck in Alaska, man.
SIBO exists for people to overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. Please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review if we've earned it, and going to our website, podcast tab, for any questions or comments you'd like to share with us. Thanks.